We'll record to the cloud. Okay, we're recording right now. Let me go ahead and pause.
Live in 5 seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1.
All right, well, good afternoon, everybody. This is another edition of the Cross and the Crescent discussion group, or what we call here on the Global Patriot Radio Network on Blog Talk Radio, the Real Interfaith Dialogue. This week, as you can see here on the screen, if you're watching in the Zoom chat, we have a real treat. We've been trying to get special guests, people that have a lot of expertise in some of these discussions that we have with Muslims concerning some of the most, I guess like you could classify them as some of the most sacred things, or things that we hold sacred. And when we start discussing those things, can get pretty heated. And today we have a gentleman who has been doing research, has been doing a lot of writing, and has spent a lifetime basically looking at Islamic history, not only through the manuscript evidence, but also through the science of archaeology. And of course, that man is Dan Gibson. And Mr. Gibson and I had a great chat about 20. He showed up 20 minutes early. That'd be a great lesson for some of you guys that are sitting in the chat room to show up early, where we could actually discuss things. But anyway, we had a great discussion. I got to know him a little bit better, and I am so excited to have him on this show today. So Dan, if you could go ahead and start us off today by giving us just a little biography of who you are, what you've done, what your experiences are, and what we're going to be discussing today. So the mic is yours, sir. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. As you said, Dan Gibson, that's my actual name. I'm not using a pseudonym or anything like that. I'm a Canadian, born and raised in Canada. My wife and I went to the Middle East in 1979, so that's a long time ago. We were just newly married, and we've been out there for, I don't know how many years, maybe 30 years or something, and then back and forth the last 10, 15 years. I have an interest in history as well as in worldview and how people think and how people see the world. And so we're very interested in learning as much we could about people. I wasn't particularly interested in Islamic history when I went out. I really was interested in just learning how people think and what goes on in their heads and things like that. And so over time, I became aware of some issues with Islamic history that I couldn't quite put together. And I always said to myself, I'm going to have to spend some time and sort of figure things out, because I was aware of the Western history and of Christian history. And I had learned quite a bit about the history of the Arabian Peninsula. That's what really interested me, was the history of the Arabian Peninsula. And I began to see that the history was kind of like two lines. I could think of my history going back in time, and so I could date everything back, going farther and farther back. But when I knew what I knew about Middle Eastern history and Islamic history, really was from the current, and it goes back to Muhammad. But as you go back, it seemed like these two histories didn't match. They didn't fit. And the things that I was learning about history in the Middle East and seeing, I was reading in Islamic history that the Middle East was just sort of vague and full of these warring tribes, and the descriptions there didn't fit what I was reading in and seeing in history on the ground, where there were the Nabateans and the Nassids and other groups, Sassians, and there was a lot of history. Yemen was, a lot of things were happening, and I thought, how in the world do I put these histories together? And I always knew that was a challenge, and I always avoided that area for the first quite a few years, simply because I knew it would be a big challenge. How do I reconcile these two histories and put them together so that they actually make sense with one another? So that's who I am. I have my desire right from the beginning was always to write fiction. And I've told my wife, one of these days soon, I'm going to retire and I'm going to write fiction like I always wanted to do. And just, but I did started tackling this Islamic history question. And that's what's really been affecting my thinking over the last 20, 25 years for sure.
Okay, and your books are, I'm going to tell you folks, and I've referenced his book several times on this show before, not only on this show, but my Tuesday evening Radio Free Kafiristan show. And I have them right here. And, I know, Dan, this is a shameless plug, but I'm plugging your books right now, Quranic Geography and Early Islamic Qiblas. These things are so rich in the amount of information about Middle Eastern history, specifically about the history of Islam, and which actually brings me to the first question that I have here. I've had several people email in questions this week to me, and I've kind of assembled them here for you. And we're going to try to group them together and make sure that they kind of all stay in the same type of genre of question. Okay, the first one deals with evidence for modern Mecca. What Quranic evidence exists that clearly teaches that the city believed to be modern Mecca is not that city? What evidence, when we start talking about evidences, we start talking about whether it's archaeological evidence, we start talking about manuscript evidence, we start talking about geographic evidence. When we start pointing a finger that this Mecca that we find in the Quran, which, oh, by the way, in your book, it tells us that it's only mentioned one time, is not that Mecca that we find in the Quran. What leads you to that conclusion?
Okay, your question was about evidence, and the first thing we have to ask is, well, what kind of evidence is acceptable? Because this is always an issue. And some people will accept certain evidences, others won't. Some people will say, well, on the Muslim side, some people will say, I don't accept the hadiths. Other people fully accept the hadiths. And others say, well, no, we have to be careful because there are weak and there are strong hadiths. So there is an argument all the time over what is acceptable and what is not acceptable as far as evidence goes. And people are always filtering through. Are we talking archaeological evidence? Are we talking historical manuscripts? Are we talking evidence of somebody writing 300 years after the fact who says something? I mean, there's lots of different questions that come up about what is actual evidence that is useful. So way back at the beginning, when I was doing my studies on the Middle East, I was aware, as I said, that these two histories didn't match up very good. There wasn't much I could take from the early history of Islam and match to what was going on in the, from a Muslim perspective, I say from a Roman or a Christian history. When you read those histories and then you read the Islamic histories, it's like there's two different worlds, and it's very hard to make them overlap so you can understand who they are. So as they said, what is the hard evidence that Mecca was it in a different place or whatever? That's a question we have to ask about what is hard evidence. For me, very early on, I was working through this Quranic geography because my first thought was I need to nail down the geography of the Arabian Peninsula. I need to know where these places are that are being referred to. And especially as I was reading through the hadiths, lots of mentions in the hadiths of names and tribes and places and people. And it's like, well, where were these? How do I put them on a map? How do I know in my mind? Because I think in pictures. So how do I know where these things fit? And so one of the things I did is I started out with drawing a map and putting on it, here's Mecca, here's Jerusalem. Now, what evidence do I have? They said the very first Qiblas faced Jerusalem. So I can put those two places. Here's Mecca and here's Jerusalem. And I should be able to substantiate that. And I had visited over the years, I like history, I'd visited quite a few different mosques. Very early on, we were up in Damascus and visited that mosque. We were living in Jordan, so I had to make trips up every 3-4 months to renew my visa. I was there at the beginning without a visa. So I made these trips up And so we started going different places. So people would say, well, this mosque faces, the Qibla faces this place, this mosque. And I was aware that there were different mosques that people said faced Jerusalem. And so I thought, okay, that's interesting. I'd like to, to note those things. And so, but right away I started having problems. So I started charting the mosques and what direction they face, the early
Okay,
mosques.
before you keep going, you said that you initially believed that the mosques were supposed to be facing Jerusalem. That was your
That
initial supposition?
that is traditional Islamic history. I assumed it was correct. And it tells us that in the first 17 months or so after Muhammad moved to Medina, the first mosques were constructed. There was a mosque in Kuba, there was the Qiblatain Mosque, there was the Mosque of the Prophet. There should have been three mosques that go back to the very beginning of Islam. And these very early mosques, they should face Jerusalem. And so I accepted that. And then I discovered there were other mosques. And so suddenly there's like Job's tomb down in Oman, in Salalah. They say, oh no, this one faces Jerusalem. I'm like, well, when did Islam reach there, and how did they face Jerusalem? And I became aware of more mosques. So I began to, I thought, this is just going to take a few days. I'm going to make up a little database, and I will just start listing all the mosques I can find and the direction of their Qibla. I thought it would be easy. This is a long time ago, so the internet was quite new, so not all the information that is out there. As I began, I realized, oh my goodness, something is different. Something is not what I expected. And so I started out in the very early days and had, I think, I don't remember, I found 11 mosques that did not face to Jerusalem, but that rather faced quite clearly to the city of Petra, or at least in that region. And so I didn't, I was trying to put this all together. So when you have that book, the Quranic geography, and I had not solidified the whole theory. All I had done was going through the geographical places in the Quran. When we came to Mecca, I pointed out the earliest mosques that I found all seemed to face the city of Petra. And then I pointed out some supporting evidence to go with it. I continued my research because I had just started scratching the surface when that book came out. So while a lot of what is in that book is good and right, it is incomplete, which is why 6 years later I brought out another book specifically on the topic of Qiblas. And that is measuring where did Muslims face in those first years. And I was surprised with what I found, really shocked. And I thought, this can't be true. I'm going to have to disprove it. And so I started trying to find all the evidence I could find that would disprove what I was finding, because I just couldn't believe it was true. And I remember going to my wife at one point and saying to her, I said, well, I thought maybe I was going to write about some conspiracy theory, about this, but I just keep finding more and more and more evidence. And so I was beginning to convince myself while I was trying to disprove it. So that's how this whole thing started. So for me, the question was hard evidence. The only hard evidence I can find is the Qibla directions and what directions they faced during the first years of Islam.
Okay, so you set out to essentially just take a survey of where those earliest mosques faced.
My survey was of the geographical locations of the Quran.
Oh, okay.
Okay, it was much, much more general. I was more interested in, what places are mentioned in the Quran.
Okay, but
because
what you found did not match that.
That's right. I studied theology for 3 years, and one of the classes I took was on biblical geography. And we got out atlases and we learned where are these places that are being talked about. So I wanted to do the same with Islam, but the resources just weren't there. And I thought, okay, I'm going to try to put together something on Quranic geography, and that's what that first book is.
Okay, and I was looking in this book, and in the chapter 15, it starts talking about some of these locations that are referenced not only in the Quran but also in ahadith literature and also in the Sirah. For an example, there's no early maps of the no early maps of the Valley of Mecca, which isn't a big deal. But we were talking about rainwater passages and surrounded by mountains. That doesn't match up, if I'm correct on that.
Yeah, a lot of the descriptions of early Mecca I had a problem with. I was very aware the desert has changed. And you can go out into the desert in Jordan and see the Umayyad palaces where they were basically big hunting lodges where these guys would go hunting. Well, they're in the desert today. There's nothing to hunt. And I was aware of studies that show that this was grassland at one time and it had become more desert. But once we get as far south as Mecca in Saudi Arabia, this has been desert for a very, very long time. And so the descriptions that, because I was going through the Quran looking for every description of every place. I have behind me Al-Tabri. I've done that. I've gone right through Al-Tabri, reading from beginning to end and highlighting every place that is a name place of somewhere, and another also highlighting a tribal name or a people name and highlighting the descriptions of these places. So I wanted to get a handle on what this was all about. And as I said, these didn't fit. Something didn't fit together. And it was hard to know at the beginning what it was, but you just had this vague idea. Somehow, how do I fit Islamic history into the rest of history that everybody else in the world knows about?
Yeah, and some of the things that you reference here, like there's supposed to be grass in Mecca, according to the Sirah. According to Al-Tabari, there's supposed to be clay and loam, dirt, trees are supposed to be in Mecca. Grapes are supposed to be in Mecca. It's supposed to be a place that could support, things that just aren't lining up. It would be large armies. I mean, how are you going to, sustain a large army when the geography itself at that time could not support the existence of civilizations or large civilizations? One of the things that I wanted to ask you about, in addition to that, was that one of the biggest polemics against Christianity is that all prophets of Islam all prophets have been Muslims. And in addition to that, since if they would have to be Muslims would have to be practicing the Hajj, a pilgrimage to Mecca. Okay, and this might be an unfair question, but is there any type of evidence that supports a large pilgrimage of any type to the city of Mecca that we know today, whether it's like because when people would make pilgrimages, they would write inscriptions on rocks as they're traveling, rejoicing about what they're doing and things of that nature. Is there anything out there that exists prior to the 7th or 8th century that indicates that?
Only in the histories and the hadiths do we find reference to this. Not in, archaeologically, it's very hard to pinpoint a pilgrimage because unless there were huge groups of people going somewhere, there's just lack of reference to these things. People would go and come back. So it would be hard to point out pilgrimage to any other place as well. So again, hard evidence is hard to come by. But Mecca has its own challenges down in Saudi Arabia. Just to get there across the desert, that last section of desert, if you're walking down, getting through the Nafud and getting down from the north, that's a real challenge to get through there. So it was a big deal for people to try to go to Mecca on pilgrimage. Of course, at that time, I only understood Mecca as being in one place, that there was only one Mecca. It wasn't till later I began to realize that this name Mecca could have been the name of an earlier place as well. And if there were two locations, so the first Qibla pointed to the first Mecca, and eventually something changed, and now the Qiblas point to the second Mecca. So then that helped me understand when I read Al-Tabari and I read some of the other historians and work through this, that when they say Mecca, they are referring to, mentally, we think they're all referring to the Mecca in Saudi Arabia, but perhaps at the time they were all referring to another Mecca in another place. So the name can be associated with multiple places. I find that all the time in North America. Many places have other place names. If you want to go to London, I want to know, I think, listen carefully, because is the person a Canadian, and is he going to London, Ontario, or is he going to London in the UK? I had somebody recently, I asked him where he's from. He said, I'm from London. It took a while in the conversation before I realized he was from London in Ontario, not London, England. And so there can be multiple places. I just go online and look up Mecca, and because the computer figures out I'm in North America, it has me looking at Mecca in the United States. There's a place called Mecca. It's
One in New York, upstate New York.
Is it? Okay. You see, so
one there, yeah.
Yeah. So you see, so that's the kind of confusion I began to realize was in the Islamic literature. It all says Mecca, but which Mecca, or how do I know it's referring to a specific place? Especially when, as you said, the descriptions were of there were olive trees, there was grass growing, several kinds of grass. There was talking about tin, which is like clay. And there's no clay around Mecca. And some of these descriptions that I got, it's like, and then when I look at the Qiblas, they're all pointing north to a place in the north where there was clay, where there was olive trees, and where there were all these things. And so I began to realize we're looking at two different focuses. The question is always going to be, how did they become two, and when did they separate to become two, or did they, or how did that work? And all those.
Yeah, and I'm going to provide you the opportunity to discuss what you have found and what your hypothesis is on that. But there's one thing that I wanted to touch on before we go there. There's two things. The first one deals with the discussion that we had earlier before the show started, was on the type of response that you've gotten to your work, where you've said that it's 90% of it is a positive response. From, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but that would be 90% of Muslims that have responded to your work have given you a positive response, even though it completely destroys this idea that Mecca of Muhammad and the Qurayshi tribe that is believed, and that we find in the literature, the Ahadith, the Sirah, and the Tasfir, is the Mecca that we have today. Can you explain, the type of responses that you get, and why you think that you would be receiving a positive response as opposed to a completely negative response? And here's the reason why I say that, and it's because of the apostasy clause in Islam. And if you look in the Reliance of the Traveler, which I'm not sure if you've ever heard of this book, but it's the jurisprudence manual for the Sharia, for the Islamic law. And in there, on page 598, it says, to deny the obligatory character of something by which consensus of Muslims is part of Islam. And that is considered to be apostasy in Islam. Now, can you try to reconcile, I know this is putting you on the spot, sorry about that, but can you try to reconcile how you get people to respond to you in a positive manner, but yet this would be considered some type of apostate type position that you're taking here?
I hope I can cover all the things that and all the things that went through my head. First of all, with the Islamic history over the last few years, there have been very little studies of the geography of the Quran, of Islamic history. And I mean, the West, we have a lot of understanding of geography and genealogies and history and chronology and all of this. Most of the Muslims that I met along the way had have very little comprehension of the geography of the Quran, and also of the chronology. What comes before what? And you've probably come across this. I remember sitting down once with a refugee, and he was writing out his story, and he was telling me all this stuff, and I said, stop. I said, let's draw a timeline. And he had never seen a timeline before, but I drew out a timeline, and then we started to put things on the timeline so I could get his story down chronologically. Because in the West, we think chronologically. He had never seen that. That was for him an amazing thing. And then for him to try to think through chronologically what had happened in his life. So there are lots of challenges when we go back. And so when we come to Sharia, just as an example, I do the same thing. I want to know who created Sharia law. When did it start? When did it happen? What, and so like as soon as you bring up the reliance of the traveler, I'm going, that's 14th century. That's late. Okay, we're 600-700 years into Islamic history when this is being written. And so we need to understand that that is also written by a subgroup of Islamic. It's Sunni, but it's more than Sunni. It is a subgroup, one of the 4 schools of law. And so, I mean, it is just a section of it. But when I go back to ask the question, where did Sharia law come from? I discover that Sharia law was invented, or it was, invented is probably the wrong word. It sort of was crystallized in people's thinking about 300 years after the founding of Islam. And the first people who did it were put to death as apostates. Okay, it wasn't till later that Sharia law sort of became established, and then it became the center. But during the whole golden age of Islam, Sharia law was not a part of that. I think it was part of, as it came into place and came into being, it was part of the whole shutting down of the creativity that was found in Islam in the first 300 years or so. But so your question, though, was the people's response to me. And I think this goes to a new opening up in Islamic thinking around the world. It started when we went out, 1979, it was just starting because people were just sending their young people to the West to be educated. And what happens when someone who's grown up, and I've seen this, I've talked to many people who've had this experience, growing up in the Middle East, going to school, memorizing everything, and knowing what the answer is for the question. And so you memorize all the questions, you memorize all the answers, you go into the exam, they ask the question, you give the memorized answer. That person who's been trained that way goes to the West, and he gets into a class and the professor says, so what do you think about this? And he's like, what? Think? He's never been asked this question before. We would do the same thing talking with our neighbors, and we explain we follow the Bible, and if sometime you want to sit down, we'll talk about it. So they would sit down with us and we'd say, okay, let's read Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the world. And then they say, what do you think that's all saying? And the person looks at me and says, think? What do you mean? And because he's not used to a teacher ever trying to get him to think through and come up with his own answers. He's used to being told, this is the answer, and now you spit it back. People follow teachers rather than following and thinking through the process for themselves. So over the last 40 years, so many young people have gone to the West and have been educated in Western frame of mind of questioning everything. We question everything in the West. We question God, we question religion, we question history, we question science, that's how we learn in the West. That's the Western form of learning. And so what has been happening in the last few years is those young people have now become adults. They've gone back to the Middle East, and they are influencing the whole way the Middle East and the rest of the world thinks. And so for the first time, people realized, I have a right to ask questions. So what did they question first? I found it very interesting that as people started questioning this Arab, it was where we were, it was called the Arab Spring. I mean, people began to question authority. They began to question their governments. They began to question their leaders. They realized sort of for the first time, they could actually openly question. Now, people would quietly question things when we were back in the early days, but here suddenly people could go out and protest, and they could be upset, and they could be angry. And this sort of seemed over a 10, 15-year period, seemed to just sort of sweep through the Middle East as people were expressing this idea. I have an opinion. I have the right to think this through. I have a right to come up with my own answer to this. And of course, the answer that they wanted was the answer they had been told all along, is that the true answer is in the religion of Islam. That's where the answer is. So every place I looked, in Egypt and all of these places, they turned to their religious leaders. And so that's why the Brotherhood came in and other places came in. Well, very shortly in many of these places, they're like, well, that's not the answer I was looking for. And they started looking elsewhere. So this has started, this whole thinking, I believe, in looking at a very big picture, has started to sweep through the whole Eastern world. Let me put it that way, that are now beginning to ask these kinds of questions. So I've come along and I begin to ask questions about the Qibla, and I begin to ask questions about the founding of Islam. And at first, if I had done this 40, 50 years ago, I would have been shut down right away, by all kinds of people. But now people are willing. I'm very surprised to see that people are willing to look at the evidence. And with the internet, they have access to resources. I remember the very first time we showed the film The Sacred City in public, and there was a number of Muslims who came to see it. I remember one lady, because her cell phone was on the whole time watching the film, and she's busy on her cell phone. And I'm like, there was, I don't know how many people were there, probably 700, 800 people at the first showing of this. Afterwards, she came up, she was just amazed, because she had been checking. Every time I said Al-Tabari said this, she checked it. If I said Bukhari said this, she was checking it. And she came up afterwards and said, I was checking your references and you were right. I've never seen those things, or I never thought about them. And so it was a chance for her to actually go and physically check, because people come, I mean, I get a few of these, especially on the YouTube channels, on the comments, people say, you're lying, you're a liar, and all this stuff. But there are people who then take the time to email me, and I'm talking about the emails coming back. People are saying to me, I've checked it out, I've looked, and I'm seeing this. That's why on the website we put up the Qibla tool. If you haven't looked at it, go and find it. Just go to the website nabatea.net, and under at the beginning it's talking about history. Go down to the founding of Islam. Click on that first link on the top of the page is the Qibla tool. You can go through and you can look now at all of these mosques and see where they are. You can zoom right down. You can check out what it says. And so this is the opening up of the inquisitive mind of the East, from the Middle East all the way to the East. People are willing now to ask questions that they were afraid to do 30, 40 years ago.
Yeah, and
does that make any sense?
Yeah, it makes perfectly good sense. I mean, this is I'm not sure if you're following this or not, but just recently there was this video that was made by Muhammad Hijab and Sheikh Yasir Qadi, that dealt with the Qur'an, or the perfect preservation of the Quran, and how this has kind of created a paradigm shift within Islam itself. People are they're now allowed to, evidently, to question, has the Quran been perfectly preserved? But what I find fascinating with what you're saying here is that, okay, they were just, many of the Muslims have been just taught this rote memorization process to,
but let me get it straight. I like the rote memorization process as long as it's combined with open thinking. I think in the West, we've gone too far in questioning everything and just throwing doubt.
Yeah, I'm a teacher. I'm down with that struggle. I'm a teacher and I get it.
Especially if you teach history, because people do need to know dates and places still.
Yeah, they do. And I completely understand that. But when we start synthesizing the history with what we see on the ground here, and this is what was confusing me, where you're just saying, well, I'm getting positive responses. And I'm thinking, well, how are you getting positive responses when this is, this type of evidence is, it's digging up at the very roots of much of the hadith, much of the seerah, much of the, the contemporaneous understanding of what Islam is. And this is where, I'm glad you explained it, that, are you saying that they just really don't completely understand the impact of this, or it's
part of it
just getting there?
Up to now, the loudest voice, and I'm going back a few years, there was a loud voice 20 some years ago that Islam was just all fiction, it was all made up. You had two choices. Either you accepted everything the way traditionally everybody told you this is the way it was, or you just came along and people saying, well, it didn't exist, Muhammad's not a person, and so there was no historicity at all to Islam. I've come along, and what I'm taking here is this, it's for most people it's a middle road, because there is historicity. These things did take place. There was a person called Muhammad. There was a city called Mecca. There were things taking place. But what has happened, I believe, is that we have a geographical misunderstanding. And so something took place when people moved from one place to the other. Very typically in North America, if you go back to London in Ontario, you will find out that the people who settled there were British people from London, England. They came over and founded London, Ontario, and you can go to Stratford-on-Avon in Canada because there's a river called Avon and there's Stratford, and you can actually go to Shakespeare's Theatre there without ever leaving North America. So they brought their culture with them, and when they established a town, they gave it the same name as where they left. And so to me, it's very perfectly obvious that there was an original place, which we can look at the Qiblas and say, you know, it was here. Later, we find those same people have actually moved down here, given it the same name, same culture, and this is in the new place. And so there are Muslims who are saying, now I understand. So many people have written and said, I've gone on Hajj and it wasn't what I pictured. It was different. And I couldn't believe these are the places. Now I look at this and go, aha, now it starts to make sense. So they haven't thought it all through, but the questions that have been in their minds, the things that they were looking at, and maybe if they're reading, Bukhari, or maybe if they're reading Ibn Hisham or somebody, they're going, now this makes sense. Now I can see this actually does fit into history.
Okay, so what I wanted to move to now is you have had alluded to that there were two Meccas. You've mentioned that a couple times already, and the original Mecca has moved. Can you expound on that? What leads you to conclude that based on your evidence?
It took a while to get to that understanding because I just didn't accept it at first. And then when I had all the other Qiblas pointing up to the area of Petra in southern Jordan, that's where they pointed. And as if you go to the Qibla tool, you can choose different selections of mosques if you want to see them patterned differently, or you can go to individual mosques and look at them. We have over 20 mosques that in the first years of Islam that face towards Petra, clearly from north, south, east, and west. So, I mean, that pattern is right there. And so, but what was its name? It wasn't until someone pointed out to me, an Armenian writer, Thomas Artzruni, who talks about Mecca being in Paran in Arabia Petrea, which was the name of a state, a Roman state, Arabia of the two Petras. And so there are two Petras, or big rocks, that were well known. Those two are both in southern Jordan. And so one was Petra and one was Sila, farther north from there. Those are the two famous places. So that's what the Roman state was. And they talk about Mecca being in the Paran Desert in Arabia Petrea. And so some commentators are just saying, well, the guy didn't know where Mecca was. But immediately it's introduced in my mind, he is looking at exactly the area where all of these Qiblas, all these mosques are facing into this area, and he's calling it Mecca. And he even says Mecca, the Mecca was in this place. And he's very, he says it very clearly. So suddenly the lights went on, and I thought, of course, they both could be called Mecca. And when I do that, then I have to go back and reread Al-Tabari and Ibn Hisham and Bukhari and decide which Mecca are we talking about here. And I need to look at Islamic history and figure out, when did this move take place? And so when they're talking about Mecca up here, that was in this place. And now when they're talking about Mecca, it's down here in this place. So don't forgetting what what the question was.
Well, what we're trying to drill down on is how did this change? How did these two different? I mean, what was the process where or that you know of, where this direction of prayer, or where this Kaaba that you're saying existed in Petra was moved to Mecca? What caused that?
Okay, now here we have to enter into my suggestions. I have to interject this because none of this material is in Islamic literature. Now, if I read some of the later stuff, even when Bukhari was around, I think Bukhari didn't even know there was an original location. He is writing 300 years after the founding of Arabia. That history, the early history, has been done away with, and by his time, it's 220 years into the whole Islamic history, and he just knows of the one Mecca in Saudi Arabia where it is today. But when you go back and read Ibn Hisham or Ibn Ishaq or so forth, you get the idea that they were aware of this. But Ibn Hisham says he edited Ibn Ishaq's stuff. And so it's been edited. He said it contained grievous errors, so he had to go back and rewrite. The only Islamic history that we have today, the earliest one, has been rewritten, and he said, I rewrote this to get rid of some grievous errors that were in it, and he doesn't tell us what the grievous errors were. Archaeology tells us when we look at these mosques that there was a group up here and now there's a group down here. And so we need to go back and try to read into it and say, well, what is it talking about? Which one of these? So that's the struggle we have, is this. So when I go back and look at Qiblas, I can look at the Qiblas are facing here, and then the first Qibla for Mecca appears down here, and then there's a between Qibla, which is between these two. So I can lay that out on a timeline. Timeline is all important for this. Get these Qiblas on a timeline, and then go back and say, so what happened at this point in this year? So we go to Amman, Jordan, and there's a mosque there. The palace is built here. They have two different Qiblas. One is pointing south, right directly at Petra. A few years later, they have another one over here that is pointing in the between position. And so it's like, well, something happened in history that Qibla was changed. And so we can narrow it down to just a few years. And then I went back and really dug through those years to get an idea. And that takes us to the Second Islamic Civil War. And that's when I begin to read. The first time I read it through quickly, and suddenly I realized, wait a minute, they tore down the Kaaba. The black stone is put into a silk here. The Kaaba building has been destroyed. It's been burned with fire. It's been hit with bombards, you know. And Ibn Zubair has dug down and torn out everything, even the foundations. I mean, we're getting an idea that this building is not it's been built and changed and tampered with during this period of time. And so that's when I go back and look at what happened here and why would they want to move it to a new location. But it's in the middle of a war. I think they got whatever was valuable, and in Islam, the black rock was the most valuable object that was there. And they took it and they went down to Saudi Arabia and they hid it in a valley down there so that because the caliphs were all up in Damascus, and so they got it as far away as they could. That's all I can see. Now, during that time, we find out that they have got lots of horses, they've got camels, they've got baggage. All these people are making some sort of move, but it doesn't tell us where, what, or how. That's all been edited out, or it has been lost or not allowed to be put in by people later on who are going through these books and manuscripts and giving us the histories.
Do you think that editing that you just mentioned, do you think that editing could have been part of Bukhari's whittling down all of those hadith? I mean, he started off with, what was it, 700,000, and he knocks it down to 8,000 or whatever. Do you think that might have been part of it? Or?
Well, for sure it was part of it, maybe without him even thinking of it. It may not have even been purposely. He's trying to figure out what is true and what is not true. I mean, one day I had a big surprise. I was going to Petra and was going down to look at the center of the city. And the Brown University was doing a dig there, and they had just discovered a Roman bathhouse right between the Great Temple and the Temple of called Kesser al-Bint. there. And so it was right down in the core of the city, right close to where I've later identified where the original Kaaba was. And it was a Roman bathhouse. And I just stopped because it shook me to the core, because I was aware in my studies of Hadith that these gatherers of Hadith had found sermons that Muhammad had preached in a Roman bathhouse. And they had said these are weak Hadiths. And so those Hadiths were dismissed. And so when Bukhari got rid of hundreds of thousands of Hadiths that he had heard from people, people said, well, this is from this. There were all kinds of these which he dismissed and which were lost to us, because he's going through what fits what is politically correct in his day. And now today we can understand politically correct. It's happening up in Canada. They're tearing down statues, they're renaming schools, we are wiping out our history of certain things in the past because we don't like our first prime minister. A lot of people, anything with his name on it, they're erasing and getting rid of because they don't like what he stood for 100 and some years later. And so there's this cleansing of our own history here. It's starting to happen in the States. What you just got to think is, another 100 years from now, will there be anything left of the history of the Civil War and some of these stuff that happened down in the States? Or will you have removed all the monuments everywhere and destroyed all the flags and so forth? What will be left for the archaeologists to find much later on?
Nada, right?
So I don't think Bukhari did it on purpose, but remember, Bukhari and all of these guys, they are being sponsored by the Caliph. The Caliph pays for the running of the House of Wisdom. The Caliph pays for the maintaining of the libraries of books. And so the Caliph wants things in the library that do two things. These were very important to them. One, the Caliph and the history of the Caliph, which is the Abbasids, is always in good light. And two, the history of Islam and Muhammad the Prophet is always in good light. Nothing should be said against him. And so nothing that even tarnishes who he is. So that's why you have to go to something like the Book of Idols, which was not written under those schools. And you start to begin to understand the guy who's writing the Book of Idols tells us about the Prophet Muhammad worshiping idols as a young man, living in this city where there were all these idols and all these things, even slaughtering an animal and dedicating food to this animal. That's all in that history. But later on, that you don't find that in the later histories, because you don't talk about the Prophet Muhammad in that same way. And today it would be difficult, especially in some countries, some settings, to mention even those names, because it gets people very upset. So this whole thing of politically correct really did influence Islam 300 years later.
Well, one of the things that I wanted to ask you, because when we start talking about the perspective and how easy it would be to write some of that history out of there, Bukhari was writing 300 years after the fact, 280, but let's say 300. And he's writing from, what was it, Damascus or Baghdad? Where's he located at this time?
I thought Baghdad, but his roots are in Iran.
Okay, so, but I mean, the bottom line is he's hundreds of miles away from the geographic locations that he's writing about or is accepting as being the actual place where these events happened. Is that correct?
Yep.
Okay. All right. We also have, I have, there was somebody that asked a question about that in the chat, and I hope that answered it for him. I don't see anything coming up after that, but if it didn't, just go ahead and follow it up in the chat for me. People that are in the chat right now, if you do want to ask a question, simply push that button down there at the bottom of the chat. It should say, have a thing for a hand, and we'll bring you in. And there is a question from a gentleman by the name of Colin here. Colin, I'm going to unmute your mic, sir. After I'm unmuted, you have to unmute yourself. And you muted yourself, I think. Colin, there we go. Now you're live, Mr. Colin. What is your question?
No, I don't actually have a question. Was my hand raised?
Your hand was raised.
Okay, so I read everything differently. So then I'll leave my question for later. That's okay.
Okay, well, yeah, we can save it for later. That's fine. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and put you back on mute. We do have a Muslim that is in the room, a young gentleman who's an aspiring teacher. It's kind of scary. Who would want to be a teacher anyway? His name's Isa, and Isa has his hand up. I've unmuted you, Isa. Good afternoon. What is your question, sir?
Hi, I want to ask about, so archaeologically speaking, I did some research on this. I don't know if you investigated this too, about the Jews of Arabia. Well, the only work I could really find was Gordon Newby's work on it. I mean, this isn't exactly the same issue, but this is like kind of questions of archaeology with Islamic tradition. And kind of the question of Jews in Saudi Arabia. I don't know if that's a field that you investigated in, but it seemed kind of it's a really kind of interesting and fascinating field, particularly to me. So I was just curious if that was something that you had engaged during your kind of research.
Hey, Isa, you've been breaking up quite a bit. Dan, did you get the question at all?
Yes, I think I did.
Okay.
I'm trying to remember somebody's name. I can find it if you want afterwards to connect with me. But if you go on to academia.edu and where all these different people are leaving papers of different scholars, you can look up Jews in Saudi, the Jewish history. But there is one Jewish scholar who was working with many others, writing on, his name might be Haggai something, or I'd have to go back and look. Anyway, I've seen his name, read some of his stuff. He is specifically doing research in that area. And so there were, of course, Jews in Medina. I just came across, somebody sent me a reference the last couple of weeks about a reference to Jews living in Petra as well. And there were, of course, Jews living in Yemen. When I was in Yemen back in the 1980s, we were aware of and had opportunity to visit a number of Jewish villages still there. Very interesting to be there. These were Jews. They even wore the curls down the side. They dressed like Yemenis, otherwise looked like Yemenis, spoke Arabic like Yemenis. And when they read their scriptures, the Old Testament, it was written in Hebrew, but in Arabic script, which was the first time I'd ever seen that. So as you look at this Arabic script and you start reading, you don't understand a word because phonetically you are reading the Hebrew language. So they had written it out in the only script that they knew, but and so that was fascinating to see that, and they are still there to this day. So there were Jews all through the area. Do you have a specific question about Jews in Arabia though?
Yeah, so usually kind of the consensus of the Jewish research investigation is that there were Jews in Yemen, but it seems that it's more dubious that were there Jews in Medina, at least according to like the auspices of the entire, of what we consider like the Jewish kind of scholarly community of now. Definitely Yemen is included, but things like what we'd say is the Arabian Peninsula, like what's called now Saudi, Mecca, Medina. That's something that I've seen.
Okay,
that could be challenged
our
24 scripture.
Okay, Isa, you're breaking up quite a bit, and it's I don't know, Dan. I don't know if you're being able to understand exactly what he's trying to say.
Yeah, I do. I have got the name of the scholar who's working on that. I'm just hunting for it now, but there is somebody who is, and he is finding all these things. So, but it will take me a bit to hunt him up. Okay.
While he's doing that, again,
Yeah.
let me reemphasize to people that are just getting here in the chat. The rooms look like it's filling up, and I see a lot of new names and faces here, and I appreciate you all coming and welcome to the show. If you do have a question for Dan, go ahead and push that button under where we have chat. There should be a hand down there. And if you want to come up on mic, just go ahead and push that button, and I'll do what I can to bring you a mic. And just as soon as you get done answering that question, Dan, I want to shift the focus to Petra and the direction of these Qibla walls and how you've arrived at these directions yourself.
Okay, are you asking when I visit a place, how do I decide or?
Well, let's just start with this. Since your documentary, the Sacred City, since you did that, have you discovered any additional mosques?
Lots and lots and lots of them.
That do not face Mecca but face Petra. Is that what you're saying?
The face Petra also faces a between position, a place between Petra and Mecca, and a few more that face Mecca and Saudi Arabia. My survey is in the first 200 years of Islam. Okay, at the end of that, I think I've included 3 or 4 other old ones that maybe are from the next century but are significant. But generally, I'm only looking in the first 200 years of Islamic history.
Okay, so when you start talking about the direction of prayer, because this was a discussion that I had gotten into one evening with a Muslim friend of mine, he was saying, well, it's just the niche that is supposed to be the direction of prayer. Can you clarify that? I can't remember exactly what the name of the niche is, because it begins with an M, if I'm not sure.
It's called the mihrab niche.
There you go. Okay. And he was saying that it was just, it can be in the corner of a building, it can be in the back of a building or something along those lines. And to me, that just it doesn't make sense. If you're given a command by Allah to Muhammad about changing the direction of your Qibla, then you should be facing that direction. So a lot of this, and I think he was being, well, I don't want to say what he was being, but the fact of the matter is I don't think he was being completely honest with me when discussing that. So can you go ahead and tell us how the direction of prayer is determined and how you have made these calculations? Because some people said that you'd used Google Earth to determine these directions of prayer. So could you clarify that for us, how you make these calculations and what you've discovered with them? Okay,
I was just looking up when they invented the mihrab niche. It was in 89 after the Hijra, or 708 AD. It didn't exist in the first 90 years of Islamic, since they went to Medina. So from the move to Medina, that's where they started building mosques. For the first 89 years, there was no mihrab niche. Didn't exist, wasn't thought of, nobody created it. We actually have in Islamic history references to when that niche was created, who created it, and in which mosques. And so it was created in Medina as well because there was confusion. And so the mihrab niche was put there so that you could tell which way the faithful were supposed to pray. Now, before this, for the first 89 years, they had what was called a Qibla wall. Now, as I'm sure you know, but maybe you're not aware, that in a mosque, people, there are no benches or chairs. So people come in, and when they pray, they line up against a long, wide wall. So if you can imagine, I don't know if you can see this, we have churches that face this way. And so we have people at the top and then all these chairs going down the long way going back. Muslims don't have this. Their buildings are oriented this way. And so people line up in long rows. So if you come into a mosque to pray and there's only a few people there, they will be right at the front in a long row across this way. Sometimes if there's only a handful of people, they all line up shoulder to shoulder. This is mentioned in Islamic teaching. Your shoulder should be touching the shoulder of the person beside you. So you get these long rows going on. So when you go to a mosque, it's quite easy to look at the orientation and decide it either faces this way or it's going to face this way. You can then say, well, which one of these is the Qibla wall? And generally the Qibla wall is unbroken. They don't put a door right in the middle. They, you know, so it's this one. Over here is generally a door where you come in, or the door may be on the sides, but there you can generally tell the Qibla wall very quickly when you walk in to a building. So if you're the only one there, you walk in, there is a big wall. Now later on in time, because there was some confusion, or because the Qibla changed from one location to another, they hung out a sign. And so you get the very first sign that's being hung up in a building, and sometimes in the corner of a building, that says Qibla. You get this today in the West when Muslims want to pray at their place of work and somebody says, use that corner. Well, they have to go over there and figure out where is the right Qibla, and then they'll put a sign on the wall or a mark so everybody knows that's the direction you're supposed to pray in. And so now you're getting mosques, because the Qibla had changed, they were now changing. And so you get mosques, which are known today even as Qiblatain. Tain means two. And so a place of prayer where there are two Qiblas. And I can take you to mosque where you can look on the Qibla tool and look, just type in Qiblatain in the search bar, and up will come the mosques that have two Qiblas in the same mosque. And so you can tell one Qibla's here, one Qibla's here. And so they were two directions of prayer. So people could choose when they came in which place they were praying towards, because obviously the Qibla had changed. So when I go into a building, it's not hard to determine it. Also, the question comes up about using satellite imagery. I began at the beginning to visit as many mosques as I could, and I would compare them with satellite imagery. For instance, in China, when I went to what was the first mosque ever built in China, I took with me a GPS unit. So I went into the mosque, looked at it, checked it, had my GPS unit with me. I went just outside because I could tell where the Qibla wall was, and then I could project after that. Sometimes we would take a long string or a rope and from one end of the building and bring it all the way out, so I could be, you know, the building is beside me, I have this rope coming out, and so we could tell exactly where this Qibla is and what direction it points using a GPS. This is a modern way of doing it, and I can check those buildings. Then I would compare it with Google Earth. Now, fortunately, there was, at the time I was living in a different place in Canada, there was a young man in our church who was a brilliant mathematician, and he got hired by Google and went off and eventually ended up in Google in Switzerland in their office. And so I wrote to him because he was a friend of mine, and I said, can you find me the answer? How accurate are the Google measurements, and can you give me some data and something I can go by? So he went to check in the Google system and put me in touch with the guys who were working with Google Maps, so I could talk with them and find out what they're doing. And they are striving for accuracy. Extreme accuracy. So that can be checked against other systems. The Japanese have a system called Aster, and I could check some of the Qiblas with that and check them with other places. As far as I'm concerned with Google Earth, not Google Maps necessarily. Google Maps is about mapping. Google Earth is that they have a very accurate system. It takes in account of the curve of the Earth and all of these things. So within a fraction of a degree, they can get it. Now, they have a disclaimer on Google Earth that backs them up from getting caught in legal disputes. In other words, I don't want, Eric over there to have a legal dispute with me over whether his fence is on his side of the land or my side of the land, if it was my neighbor. Okay? Google says, we don't provide any guarantee of accuracy and especially for things like legal cases. However, when you talk to the programmers, they're like, we're extremely accurate. Okay, we've been working at this over the years, but they don't want to get involved in legal disputes, so they put a disclaimer on their website. So I was comparing GPS taken on the ground with sometimes with actually shots taken of the stars using astronomy, depending on who's traveling with me. Also looking at satellite imagery, different satellite imagery to try to figure out, and they're all very, very accurate. I don't think the Muslims in the first 2 centuries of Islam, were as accurate as we can get it today. Certainly not so. And they were within a couple of degrees. On average, it's about 3 degrees that they were, it would vary off of their
Well,
accuracy.
that was a question that's being posed in chat. It says that the direction to Kaaba is done based on the astronomy of the Bedouin Arabs at the time, and you're saying that the variance there is only between 1 to 3 degrees based on the calculations what we have today. Okay,
that's right.
All right, I want to make sure that we got that out.
And I let me just say something. I would disagree with the use of the word Bedouin. I don't think the Bedouin had anything much to do with the founding of Islam. The Quran speaks very derogatively of the Bedouin as well. If you look at it, the people back at the time, the Quraysh and others, were city dwellers. They lived in cities. They were merchants. They moved their goods by caravans through the deserts. They were able to say, wherever they were, where is the city that I want to take these goods to, and take the camel caravans directly across the desert and arrive at a city that was beyond the horizon. This was a skill that merchants have. Muhammad was related to merchants. Muhammad even went on merchant journeys and trips. And so he saw and he knew and he experienced what the navigators were doing in his time. That wisdom, I just point this out, was very quickly lost after the Muslim armies moved out of the whole Arabian setting into the Syrian setting, and then Egyptian, and then over into the east. They were now using Roman roads. The amazing thing about the Roman Empire was that every mile they had a milestone put up. And so you could tell where you were, how far you were, and calculate. Nobody needed to use the stars anymore. And very quickly, within a generation, the use of the stars for navigation amongst the merchants of Arabia, that was lost.
What century was this, did you say?
This was during Muhammad's lifetime.
Okay. 7th century. All right.
Yep.
Okay.
And so, I mean, after that, there were a few skilled people who were able to do this. You see this in Al-Tabari when he's telling the story when they captured Jerusalem. Okay, and now they were going to put a place of prayer. And there's a whole discussion of, or is the ground holy? Do you take your feet off or don't you up on the mountain and so forth? And then they're talking about, now we're going to build the mosque. This is Al-Aqsa Mosque. Actually, Al-Aqsa is not the first mosque. There was one previous to it on the same spot. And so they were talking about also, how do we determine the Qibla? And there's one man they call on to help them determine the Qibla direction. So it's not something that everybody was doing by that time. We're talking now, the second or the third Caliph after Islam. But I mean, already this whole idea is being lost because of the merchants were the ones who moved goods across the desert. It was the merchants who were able to determine navigation in the desert, and that was quickly disappearing.
Okay, so when you start saying that the direction of the Qibla was originally used by the stars, they're using astronomy.
I believe so. Yes.
Okay. Well, based on what you know. Okay. So when we look at those Qiblas, could there be enough variance in what their understanding of astronomy? Because this is what I see going on here in chat, is that okay? So they were not all that great of astronomers, or the ability to find a direction. Could that account for the variance between the Qiblas that face Petra to Mecca, where it would just be a mistake because they could not follow the the direction by astronomy?
That's why, again, I would ask people to go to the Nabatea website. That's NABATAEA, every second letter is an A.net. And then go down to the founding of Islam and look at the Qibla tool. If you do that, you will see that there was a mosque built in Yamama in Saudi Arabia. Yamama is out in the desert. It's a bit east and north of Mecca. And its Qibla points northwest. And it should be pointing southwest.
When you say
And
it points northwest, is it Jerusalem or Petra? I mean,
Petra, well,
it's
no, it's actually, I believe, it's a between mosque,
okay, between Jerusalem and Petra.
between Petra and Mecca.
Between Petra and Mecca. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So you're saying, what you're essentially saying is that it does not account, that variance does not account for
No,
just
and
a simple
because
mistake,
it's
a calculation mistake.
because it's north of Mecca, it should be pointing south.
Sure. Yeah. I mean,
And this is not a little mosque. This is the congregational mosque in Yamama. This is the main mosque of the city. And it's pointing, now it's out a few degrees from the between position, but that's the direction it's pointing.
completely off.
Completely off.
Yeah.
That's why when you look at the Petra Mosque, they're from north, south, east, and west, from all directions, pointing at Petra.
And that's what I
surprised
find
me.
amazing, because you have it in Europe, you have it in North Africa, you have it clear. Was it clear over in China, isn't it? You got something clear over in China.
Well, yeah, at the mosque in China. Yeah, I looked at that one.
How many mosques have you been to? Estimate, ballpark, 20?
I have
15?
no idea. And sometimes it's almost by chance. I was invited to go to China to speak on a totally different topic, and I said, on one condition. Then I found out that it was actually going to take place in Canton in China. I said, but I need an afternoon off, and I need a translator to go with me, because I want to go visit some mosques. And they said, yeah, sure, we'll do that for you. So suddenly I found myself, in China, being able to go down and make my measurements. And when we arrived at the mosque, not a soul was there. We were able to walk in, nobody around. I had a lady Chinese translator, and went around and went into the mosque, made all the measurements, did everything. As we were going out, somebody showed up, and then he was quite upset that we had been walking around inside this mosque because he said no, foreigners would never be allowed in here, and especially not a Chinese woman who's not a Muslim, and so forth. But so we got in and were able to go all through that. Every time, I go back to the Middle East every year, sometimes twice a year. I try to go to different places. So I'm checking mosques. I've been to Oman. I've been to Yemen. I've been through Saudi, through all of these places. We lived in Jordan for many years, been to Egypt, been through Syria, lots of places. So I can't suggest how many. It's been 20, 25 mosques at least that I personally visited. And then I've I've done studies that scholars have done, so I've access to the reports and especially the maps and the charts that have been done, excavations that have been done different places give us archaeological reports.
And those reports give you an indication of which direction the Qibla would have been.
Usually they do. Yep, they have a little sign on their chart. Here's north. North is in that direction. We can work it out from there. If they often they don't measure the Qibla, that's very frustrating. So then I have to be able to use photographs and identify this, especially in Spain and the graveyards in Spain. I had to go and look at. Look down on a satellite imagery there and see where this is, look at the pictures that they took, what buildings are, and recreate it so I can figure out what direction were people buried in this graveyard. Others are much easier. I can go, or I can ask somebody else to go, or if there's a scholar visiting there, or if there are reports done by the different archaeologists, and we can work these out. Always check on the ground with a satellite image, because I remember in Israel, I had a friend who said he's going to Israel. He actually goes every couple of years. And I said, there's a couple of mosques I need checked in Israel. Could you go do them? Because he's been following a lot of what I do. I said, let me train you how to check and how to look and use a GPS unit and be able to figure things out. And I need photographs, and I need, you take picture, make sure you have another cell phone, take picture of the phone that you're using with a GPS unit in it, and send them back to me so we could work on that. So when I went onto YouTube, which was right after the film was made, people started writing back to me from all over the world. I get hundreds of emails of people saying, what about this mosque? Or can you check this mosque? And places I had never heard of. And so suddenly I'm going back and looking to find, well, who did the archaeology in this area? What year was this mosque built? And what is the orientation of the mosque? And so all of that we've been putting together. That's why when you go to the Qibla tool, there's over 100 mosques in the first 2 centuries of Islam that we can check.
Yeah,
photographs of them. And
what's interesting to me is that a lot of people don't realize is that Spain had been conquered almost, well, within 100 years of the death of Muhammad, and had been ruled by Muslims for, was it 800 years, 900 years?
Right.
And you referenced the Cordoba Mosque, and I'm looking in your book here. The Cordoba Mosque in Spain was built 784, so that's 150 years after the death of Muhammad, and it's still not facing Mecca.
No.
It's a parallel mosque, you're saying?
None of the mosques in North Africa, or not Egypt, but when they were going beyond that, none of the mosques there face Mecca in Saudi Arabia. They all face south from there at an angle, a particular angle. Is the average. There's an angle that they'll have. Now some are a little bit off, and there's 1 or 2 that are kind of wildly off. So I had to go back and figure out, again, use a timeline and put all these mosques on a timeline to figure out who started this. When did this start? And I find a guy by the name of Dinar was his last name, General. I'd have to go back and look it up. He was put in charge of the armies in North Africa. At this point, they're only back about Libya somewhere, marching across, and he ends up having a dispute with the Caliph who's in Damascus. And so he had started building a mosque of which was going to face towards Petra. That's the very interesting thing when I looked at it. This mosque faces Petra. But halfway through, he has this argument with the people in Damascus. And so if you can imagine, the mosque is built, in a particular direction. And, well, let's use it this way. And they're going to face this way. He suddenly changes the Qibla wall to this way, extends his map farther on, and it points down south. And it's basically a line parallel to what you would find between Petra and Mecca. So if I drew that line parallel between Petra and Mecca, that's where because he couldn't decide, because they've got this whole argument. Is it Petra? Is it Mecca? And everything going on. They have right at the very same time, you have Hajjaj over here, who's the ruler of the eastern half of the Islamic Empire, and he is chosen this between Qibla, and all of his over 20 mosques that he has built all face between Petra and Mecca, because you can't choose one or the other. This guy here just makes all of his parallel, and every mosque after that built in North Africa and all the ones in Spain are all built using a parallel Qibla. And
Okay.
There's over 20 of those mosques.
And you think that's because of the political climate at the time? I know your movie,
Yep.
Your Sacred City, does a good. I have that, by the way, too.
Right, the Sacred
It
City
does a good job of discussing that.
a bit. I mean, I found this out after we released the Sacred City. So, I mean, a lot of stuff that's on the website and in the YouTube videos comes after the Sacred City.
But when you were discussing in the Sacred City, there was contention between the Umayyad and the Abbasid empires.
And we knew they was parallel. You could see that by these mosques. It's what I've called it. I've called it parallel. You can some people would call it an African Qibla because it's its own separate thing, but it was done. What's interesting is that very first mosque that was done that, what he did when he switched the direction of the mosque and then extended it this way, you know what he put over here? He built the latrines or the bathrooms between him and the Caliph in Mecca.
Oops, yeah.
And so they sent out another general, and they deposed him and went on. But there was this ongoing problem between North Africa.
Well, isn't it? I believe there's there's something in the Sharia that says that you cannot have bathrooms or latrines facing the same direction as the Qibla towards Mecca. It's in built-in
you don't
code.
want to, for the reason of honor, you want to honor the prophet, you want to honor your city, you don't want to bury your bottom or your front to it. So bathrooms in the Middle East, everybody's aware of, well, when you use the bathroom, so I mean, Muslims are aware that you're not
facing that direction. Sure.
Facing Mecca and Saudi Arabia.
We have a question in the chat. He's asking for a link for your book for people who live in Muslim countries who cannot buy his book from legal channels. Number one, are you aware that, and I'm not sure if he's from a Muslim country, he doesn't give me an indication of that, but are there countries in the Middle East right now or Islamic countries that don't allow you to sell your book in those countries?
I am not aware. The problem is with payment, because places like Amazon don't take payment from Afghanistan or Pakistan or some of these countries. And the same with PayPal. They don't take payment as well.
Are you able to sell your books through nabatian.net or?
Their books are on there. I would suggest that he go to nabatia.net and send an email to the bottom of every page there. It says contact, and it gives the web address for the webmaster. Go there and send me an email personally. Say that you were on this, you saw it here, and you would like a copy. I will send you a URL of where you can download the book for yourself as a PDF file.
Okay, all right. I think that answered. If you have any additional more questions in chat, just go ahead and post it there, and we'll bring that up. Okay, let's talk about your fans, all of your fans, specifically a guy by the name of David King. David has raised some objections about your work. Can you give us kind of an overview of what his objections are and what your responses are to those objections?
David King is both good and bad for me, as far as I'm concerned. He raised a huge awareness all around the world of the studies I've been doing. I mean, so lots of people came because he was so angry and he was so just bitter and saying all kinds of crazy things that it got a lot of attention and a lot of publicity because of that. So, and that side was good. Now, his biggest argument at the beginning, you got to understand, Dr. David King is a scholar. He is a scholar of the highest level of being a scholar. He has studied mathematics and astronomy and Islamic history, and he carved out a niche, an area for himself in understanding what the Qibla was all about during the medieval time. So this is from 900 up until the 1400s, 1500s. He is the scholar for that area, and I tell you that, read his stuff. He's very good in that period of time.
So 3 centuries after Muhammad is where his expertise begins.
Pardon me?
3 centuries after Muhammad is when his expertise begins.
Yeah, 3, 4, 5. It sort of begins there, but really he studied, some of these scholars he studied were in the 1200s, 1300s. Okay. He became very upset at one point when I, in the very first book, quoted an article from the Encyclopedia of Islam and mentioned it and spoke, I mentioned it and quoted it. I did not, and I will confess this, I did not put who the author of the article was. I just put Encyclopedia of Islam, volume such and such, page such and such. He became very upset because I had not put his name on the article. I heard about this from some of the students who were in his classes. And then that began him being upset with me. And so he then complained that not only did I not recognize him as the world scholar, that I didn't put down any of his writings. I didn't say he's the world scholar. I did not acknowledge what he had written about Qiblas and everything else. And so he blamed me then as an amateur, uneducated, no knowledge in the field. And then he just went off the deep end and accused me of all kinds of things, which we won't get into. I've made 6 different videos. It's on my YouTube channel where I try to answer him back. And I know Jay Smith has gone through and done a whole bunch of stuff as well on his YouTube channel, trying to look and take apart Dr. King. Now, the problem with Dr. King, there's 2 things. is, what did I write down here? His objection, okay, is do people understand what is he proposing? So what is he upset with and what is he proposing? He's upset with that I didn't acknowledge him and accept his ideas that he had presented. Now, just briefly, let me just say that Dr. King discovered and he's the discoverer, he's the one who revealed this and wrote papers about it, in the Middle Ages, that's from a Western point of view, at the end of the golden age of Islam, there were scholars there who recognized that there was a problem with the Qiblas. They would look back at the first Qiblas, and they called these the Qiblas of the companions of the prophets, so the companions of the prophet, they built these first mosques, and their Qiblas are all wrong. They recognize that. And so in the Middle East, during the Middle Ages, some of these scholars who were now mathematicians and astronomers, they began to recognize there was a problem, and obviously we can determine the Qibla now because we have math and astronomy. And so one of the writers there, he said that back then they hadn't smelled the sweet fragrance of arithmetic. Okay, so they were just wrong in their Qiblas. And so he tried to, and different writers suggested different ways that they could have mistakenly done this. And they said, well, maybe when somebody was visiting the Kaaba sits in a certain direction. I don't know which way you are, Howard. And so maybe they were at this corner and they recognized this corner pointed in this way. So when they went home, they ended up pointing their Qibla here. Maybe they saw the Kaaba building and they saw this corner, and so maybe they pointed it here. They also talked about the wind and the four winds, and maybe they experienced the wind on their back. They went home and then they turned their Kaaba to face this way because they were ignorant. This is the argument that Dr. King uses, is that they were basically ignorant and they weren't able to measure the Qibla or duplicate it. Now, he goes on. He says one of the things they did is they have what is called archaeoastronomy. And this is a field that has been developing. It started with Gerald Hawkins, who was the guy who went, first of all, to Stonehenge and did all the measurements all over. And of course, there are billions of stars in the sky. So when you go to Stonehenge and you see all these things all standing around and you go from here to there, did you know that these two stones line up on when the equinox is on? Or did you know that these two stones over here line up and they face this particular star in the sky? Now, at first, that was all laughed at. But eventually, it has grown in popularity. People are beginning to do it. There's a guy by the name of Dr. Bell. I should pull up his name here if I give people's names right.
You might get in trouble for not being correctly attributing something. Might get somebody's feathers ruffled.
Here, and I've deleted it off this page.
That's kind of shallow when somebody is upset when they're cited in a work. What was it, the Islamic Encyclopedia, and you just simply you cite the Islamic Encyclopedia with not being more specific. This is kind of one of those kiss the ring type things.
Right.
This seems what got his undies in a bunch to begin with. Now, you were.
Can I go back and just finish one point here?
Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Robert Hoyland is the expert in Islamic history. He is one of the scholars on the Islamic side, very highly respected. He wrote this about Dr. King's. This is long before I ever came along. He said his theories, speaking of Dr. King's, are insightful and revealing of medieval times, but do not stand up when retrojected to the first 2 centuries of Islam. So he's saying that's fine. These guys in medieval times started looking at where the stars were and lining them up and saying, this is how it faced. And so when I read Dr. King's stuff, the stuff that he is suggesting is just that Arabs were dumb and stupid, and they just took some aspect home and got it all wrong. And I began to look, and please go to the Qibla Tool website when you have to afterwards and see and look at the data and see, are these Qiblas not grouped into 4 different Qiblas. And can you not see that all the mosques pointed here, and then they pointed here, and they pointed over here? And they're very close when you look at those four. It's not just random, but Dr. King was amazed when he saw this. He said, people looking at this, he said, I've never seen this collection of Qiblas before. Reason is, he says, the only Qibla he ever measured was the one in Samarkand. The others he's read about in a few other books, but really he didn't have a big picture. And now I took many years to go through, visit all these places because I wanted the big picture. And it would be nice if Dr. King would at least recognize that we've done the research and published the data and put it out there for people to see. At this point, I've moved on because most of the other scholars have just backed away from him and what he's been saying. Okay, so yeah, and so let's just summarize this distractor, because this is one of the major areas of contention that we get from Muslims, is that, well, Dr. King has refuted you, and when we bring up the fact that he hasn't, then of course, that's when the sparks start flying. But one of the things that I noticed here is that, okay, you say he's visited one mosque. Is that correct? Yeah. Okay. Number two, his expertise does not lie in the earliest Qiblas. It lies in Qiblas or mosques that were built 400, 500, 600 years later. Number three, when we look at his work and he starts referencing these earlier mosques, which he does not seem to have expertise in, his only reasoning behind this is well, those people were too stupid to know, or they just did not have too stupid's a bad word. Let me rephrase that. They did not have the proper knowledge in order to build the mosques in the same direction. And I'm just going to say this. A couple of weeks ago, a friend of ours that comes to this show and is a co-host, Chris Claus, had a debate with a gentleman by the name of David Montgomery, who's a Unitarian. And there's a caboose to this train of thought. Stay with me. David Montgomery's whole thesis of presenting the thesis is that the earliest followers of Christ did not believe that Jesus was God incarnate. They believed that he was the Son of God, but he wasn't God incarnate. And he bases that off of his exegesis of Scripture, of the Gospels. But when Chris brought up the fact that, look, if you look at the earliest fathers, the earliest church fathers believed that they were taught by the apostles that Jesus was God incarnate. This is what their writings reveal. So and this is where the caboose comes in, David King is making the same fatal mistake. He's saying, look, I'm basing my idea on what I have read from Bukhari, from Muslim, from the Sirah. Yeah. All these. Dr. King has not read Bukhari or the Sirah. He's read people 200 or 300 years even after that. Okay, and all mathematicians and astronomers. Okay, so he's using data that has nothing to do with what the first century people believed or what they knew. And for instance, he wrote a paper. The paper that he wrote his thesis on or whatever was written with Dr. Hawkins. And in it he mentions that these guys were saying, those early Arabs had not smelled the sweet aroma of arithmetic, and without arithmetic they couldn't solve the problem of the Qibla. We have arithmetic, therefore we can solve the problem of the Qibla. And so this is Dr. King's whole argument. He said they cannot do it because they didn't have arithmetic. He quotes what the Islamic people at that time were saying and completely takes their argument, and he refuses to admit that these Qiblas, and he just says it's by chance. It's just by chance that Qiblas faced here, or just by chance that they face there. This is why Dr. Walter Schum has released a paper, you'll see it there on the website, where he looked at the probability of these things happening by chance. And so he's published this. It's a published paper, and you can read that paper as well and look at it, because the chances of all of the Qiblas in the world pointing at 4 different places is just is astounding that it would ever happen. It's not chance. It was by design. But there could be a chance. Very, very little
No.
chance. Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean-
that's that's the point I'm trying to make. Okay,
Right.
we got a couple other things that I wanted to address here, if you don't mind. Macorba.
Okay.
This was brought up. Ptolemy, you know, the great Roman historian. Okay, this was brought up. Macorba is, and here's I'm just going to let you know what, when I engage Muslims with your material, I engage them with the premise that there is no extant evidence, physical evidence for the existence of Mecca prior to the 7th century. There's nobody writing about it. There's nobody mentioning it on any maps. There's no archaeological evidence for it, period. And then this was brought up. This was thrown back at me. And I went back and read your article on Macorba on Nabatean.net. Can you explain to us why Macorba is not Mecca?
Okay. I had that question. I had to answer that for myself back in the time when I was inquiring. Now, first of all, to understand Ptolemy did up his description of the world back in the 1st century AD. So that's when he was around. He did this up. He gathered information from people that he met, and he charted everything. Now, he charted them on a globe. He had a big globe, and when people would come, he would ask sailors who had been somewhere, what did you see, what was, and they would give him the names of places, and he would chart them on these places. And unfortunately, his chart, his globe that he made, he was in Alexandria, was too small for the world. He was out by 28,000 kilometers. I forget what exactly it is in his circumference of the earth. This is why Columbus, over 1,000 years later, his maps are still being used.
Let me just say something about that, Dan, because this is my experience as a teacher. When I start discussing, you know, why Christopher Columbus, because this is the content that I teach, why Christopher Columbus was so far off. What I do is I stand in front of the class with 2 globes. One is a big globe and one's the center globe. And I tell them, I said, this is Christopher Columbus's globe, derived from the teachings of Ptolemy, and
Right.
This is the globe that is actual. So this is the important part, what you're addressing with Ptolemy here. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's a very good. I wish I had 2 globes to do it with. So his globe was smaller than it was, and he was guessing in many cases of where places were. But he was trying to put his globe together of how the world was understood in his day. So he had his own coordinate system that he worked out. We do not have that globe. We do not have any maps that he drew. All we have are numbers. So he would say, now inland, and he would say the numbers. And you'd say on the coast, there's this place, and he would give the numbers. Macorba is listed in the line of on the coast is this place. So he's been told by sailors that this place was on the coast. Mecca is not on the coast. So number one, that, it doesn't fit, and the numbers. Now, remember, Ptolemy is again guessing, and so when I studied Ptolemy, I took his number system, not the maps, because when you go to the maps, you're looking at maps for the next 1,000 years that are all based on Ptolemy. It's not until we get the British with their latitude and longitude, and the Turkish at the same time, and the people from Holland and all these countries suddenly started sailing, and they started getting interested in maps, and new maps just started flourishing. So from the 1600s onwards, new maps are appearing. But we want to look at the old maps. Well, unfortunately, almost every map says after Ptolemy. It'll say that on the map. And you're looking at the same information, just drawn by a different person. And so that's why Macorba is so important. Now, let's ask ourselves the question, have Muslims always understood that Macorba was the original place? Well, if you go back and look at history, that whole idea of Macorba is less than, well, it's just over 100, was it over 100? 200 years. Maybe it's 200 years now. But it came up, and I've got it written down. I've done the research. I haven't put it on a video yet. by a man who was trying to say that the Phoenicians traveled everywhere. It was his big theory. And so he decided that it went around, and he chose Macorba, saying this has got to be Mecca. It was a Western scholar, late 1800s or 1700s, who put this whole thing together. Now, his theory on the Phoenicians was never accepted and never turned into anything, but somehow somebody picked up this Macorba equals Mecca. So in the 1700s, they started making the very first encyclopedias, and that's where Mecca appears as Macorba on the map. And so ever since then, that has sort of been put together. Muslims have not picked up on this, except in the last few years, maybe 50, 60, I would have to go back and look at, when Muslims picked up on this idea. It is not an ancient idea. It's not an old idea. It was never, ever proposed by any scholars anywhere, except it goes back to one guy who was working on a conspiracy theory that everything goes back to the Phoenicians, and he's the guy who put the two together. So that's a little bit of history of how we got Macorba there. So I went back and started looking at all of these and putting them on a map and starting out, trying to figure out this map. And the problem I had was, well, how do you line these cities up? Because Ptolemy's names don't match with modern names, or even the old names that we know. It's very hard. So there were a few we had, like Yathrib in the north. We have Yathrib. We can put that together. There's Egra, which is Hegra, which is Madat and Salith today. We can put that there. Ptolemy's Roman world is not bad, but as he moves farther away and as he goes over to India and as he gets down to Sri Lanka, things get out of proportion because he didn't understand distances. But there were 4 rivers in Arabia mentioned by Ptolemy. That caught my attention, because what are these 4 rivers? That's the first thing I began to ask. Where are these 4 rivers? Because I have trumped all the way through Yemen and down into Oman, and I've been over into the Emirates and up into Kuwait and all these places. I mean, these are places that I know, that I've gone through. We were out in the empty quarter back when I was in 1981. My daughter was born in a hospital out in the deserts in the Emirates, you know. So, I mean, I have an idea of where these places are, and I've gone to them. And so what are these 4 rivers? And so I began to look and figure out what 4 rivers is he matching up, because it would be something that a sailor going by on the ship would say, that's a river. Not necessarily because Ptolemy didn't know the inside of Arabia. He got his information from sailors. And so I worked out, and you can go to the website, you can read the paper. It must be at least 10 years ago I wrote it. And where the different rivers were, I charted these on a map, although people can pick and choose, but there's a great wadi that comes down. And it's because what happens here is right beside these places that are mentioned, is this river, the Batius River. And there are islands that are mentioned and so forth. And so as I looked at it, I plotted with no reference to the cities. Forget the cities. We can't figure out the cities, a big argument. Let's plot the 4 rivers. And then we realized that that shifted all of Ptolemy's things together, because we just put the rivers in, and once we put the rivers in, we recognized that Ptolemy didn't realize how much desert was in the middle of Saudi Arabia. And so the places that were around Yemen had all moved north. And so that's why this place appears to be Mecca, because it starts with M, and Mecca starts with M, but and it's got a C in it, so Macorba must be Mecca. I mean, it's just the only reason people have associated those 2 names is because they both have an M and a C in it. There's nothing else to give you that idea. It's not on the coast. It doesn't have a river beside it, and so it's in the it doesn't fit the rest of Ptolemy's. So once we charted the 4 rivers, we could use a computer-generated map to shift all of these things south to where they belonged according to the rivers, and suddenly the names all through Yemen started to make sense. And we recognized that there's this desert that Ptolemy hadn't got in his mind, because Ptolemy had never been to these places, and he hadn't realized how big the desert was. And so the places in the north stay there, the places in the south move down, and suddenly all the names make sense. But Mecca is not on that map, doesn't exist on that map as Mecca or as a great place. Plus, archaeology, they've been digging up in Mecca all over the place. They have not been finding the great city described with a temple of Al-Uzza and a temple of Alat and a temple to Dushara, the temple to Hubal, that's not there. The city walls that went around Mecca is not there. I mean, the archaeologists I talked to from Saudi Arabia just say none of that exists. It's not there. And the few places that they do say, well, this is an early place. Actually, they are not dating back to that time. There's nothing they can date back to early history.
Okay, so the takeaway on this is that those 4 rivers that are mentioned by Ptolemy do not correlate with what the current location of the city of Mecca is today. I mean, that's just the bottom line. All people do is
look at Mecca's about here. They go to the map and say, oh, look, there's a place called Makorba. And so that's got to be it.
Sure. Okay. And then
also that idea has no historicity to it. It got into some early encyclopedias, and then they got copied and copied and copied. And that's just what's in some encyclopedias today.
Yeah, it's the same mistake being made over and over and over again. Now,
like Columbus, afraid he's going to fall off the edge of the world. Yeah. I mean, it wasn't there. It's not in history. It never happened.
Right, and that's something that you have to teach the kids, that they always thought that the Earth was round. This idea that we had a flat Earth
it goes back to a novelist who wrote it in his novel.
He wrote Whit Van Winkle. What's that guy's name?
Irvin Washington.
There you go, Irvin Washington. Yes,
yeah.
Yes, I know. Yeah.
He needed somebody to be against Christopher Columbus, so he said, well, they were afraid the world was flat. He created the whole flat Earth thing.
Exactly.
And today there are all kinds of people claiming it's true when it was all created by a novelist in a novel.
Right, and they want to blame it on. There's an attempt to blame the Catholic Church. I had one. What you alluded to something very, very important, and I don't think maybe people didn't pick up on it. But the history of Mecca itself is not supported by the archaeological evidence that we have today. And I'd like you to comment on that. But the one thing that people may or may not be aware of, but if you go to the city of Mecca today, almost the entire city itself, or what would have been the original city that surrounded the Kaaba, where the Kaaba is today, if we were to assume that this was the city that existed, it's been completely cemented over. They built high rises all around it. There's no city walls. Can you comment on that, Dan?
Well, there are lots of names that are there. One of them is doesn't come to my mind right away. Anyway, there's like a very narrow area where there's supposed to be the house, certain houses, whatever, and Khadija's house supposed to be. It doesn't exist. I mean, the name is on an area there, but it doesn't fit the descriptions. There's lots of places they say this was here or this was there. It doesn't fit the descriptions. But I mean, like people who are believe in Islam and believe the traditional account, they're making animated maps and beautiful things that they're putting out with all of these places on it, as if they were there was historicity to them. But I was at a conference. I had a chance to talk to several archaeologists who are Saudis and who were familiar with. They were doing excavations in Saudi Arabia, and when I don't give their names, but when we had a chance to talk privately, they said there is nothing there. There is no early history. They admitted that to me. They can't publicly go out and say that. But I believe this is why Saudi Arabia is against people making these places of worship and reverencing the location. They feel that they can do this because there is nothing opposing them as far as buildings on the ground. They're not tearing down city walls. They're not pulling down great stones that are marking out the area of Masjid al-Haram, the forbidden area. They're not, those things don't exist there. And so they are creating a modern city. And but the archaeology, they're not destroying archaeology because there's not archaeology there to destroy.
Right, it's not existent. And this is you know, you mentioned that this was the house of Khadijah, or there was I think there was a cemetery that was named there or something along those lines. These names and places, I would say, are probably akin to the mother of Constantine traveling to the Holy Land, you know, 2.5 centuries after the fact, 3 centuries after the fact, and saying, well, where was the Sermon on the Mount given? Well, let's go build a church there. Where did this happen? Well, let's go build a church there. And there's probably some truth to those locations, but they're not ingrained in you know, archaeological fact. You just can't go out and demonstrate it through the use of archaeology. I had one more question for you. We're getting down to the end, and you know, I could keep you here until the cows come home, sir. You're just a wealth of knowledge. Yeah, I'm sorry about that, but we got about 10 minutes left. There was one term that was used here, paleontology. I looked at that. I don't even know what that word meant, so I had to look it up. And it's the study of dirt, evidently. Can you tell us how the study of dust? Let's put that. Okay. Can you tell us how that relates to the history of Mecca and what we find in the literature, and why what we find in the literature does not correlate with what we find in this study?
Okay, in any study of history, we're interested in getting a bit of the dirt from the time period. One of the things I learned from different archaeologists when I was out there is when they were digging up graves, and they would dig up ancient graves, very often on the eyes of the person that was buried, a coin was put on either eye. And so that coin is there to keep the eyes closed. So when they buried it, and they would say that's to pay the whoever's to take them across the river to the other side or whatever they buried. And so sometimes people even would throw a few coins into the burial site as the person was being buried to help them if they ever needed money on their way. So when you dig down to a grave site and you have a body, you have coins with which you can date, and you have dirt that was thrown into that hole there that you can use because it was dirt that was on the surface, and you can use that to date the dirt. Now, why do you want to date the dirt? Because when you put it under a powerful microscope, you can see the spores and the pollen of plants that were alive when the burial happened. And so that is very useful. They also do these same studies when they're drilling wells going down for water, because you can, you know, pick up down 5 feet, 10 feet, 20 feet, 100 feet down, and then they will look at those that dirt that they're pulling out of there to see what's in that dirt, what's interesting about it. Because if you go down, you might have coal, you might have plants, you might have other things that are under layers that have been laid down over time. So, for instance, in Petra, when they were doing the excavations there, they pull the dirt from different levels and they put it under a microscope, and they found out that Petra had lots and lots of different trees. There was lots of grass, lots of trees there. And if you go back in history, you find out this area actually it was like semi-forest when Petra existed there. So access to wood was not the problem it is today. The desert has grown, and so those trees are gone. And a lot of those trees were cut down by the Ottomans, the Turkish Ottomans, to keep people from uprising, take their trees away. They can't build ladders, they can't fight forts. I mean, that kind of thing. So there was a great stripping of the land of all of these trees. So this gives us a picture of what things are like. Now, in Saudi Arabia, the archaeologists have done a few of these studies. What is interesting is the people digging wells have done a lot of these studies, looking back at the area. And so we can now plot, you can go through looking at these different studies from different areas of science, not just from archaeology, and we can get a picture of what did the landscape look like, you know, back during the time of Muhammad, and it gives us a picture. Mecca is still a barren valley. It still has dry desert conditions. It is not a place with trees and grass and all these other things growing there. You have to go up over the mountains and into another valley before you would find anything like that.
So in other words, this science that people are are so emboldened to does not support the traditional Meccan
And as you
location.
see in the book, Early Islamic Qiblas, we talk about the Qiblas, and then we have 50 supporting pieces of evidence. And this is one of those supporting pieces of evidence. So by itself, it doesn't say a lot. But when you combine it with all the other evidence, and you've got 50 supporting evidence, and then you've got the data of these Qiblas, the whole thing together draws a different picture about what was happening in those first years of Islam.
Okay, so it's the preponderance of all the evidence coming together that demonstrate Petra. Okay. I think we have one more question here. The Quraysh tribes and evidence for Muhammad's family there. Do we have any evidence, or is there any evidence that you're aware of that can put Muhammad, the Quraysh tribe, in modern day Mecca today? Is there anything out there that you're aware of?
The study of tribes is quite interesting because we can't go back 500, 1,000 years and say this tribe lived here, because we don't have record of where the tribes were. Now, there's some graffiti in some places, so there's a few things you can do. Now, tribal names are interesting because tribal names evolve. Tribal names are usually named around an important person, and so that's known for several hundred years. When a new important person then rises, then that line from there becomes important, and the other ones, so these names don't particularly follow all the way back, through time. And I've had tribal historians, the Bedouin, I've sat down with them. I've listened to their history. They're going back. I was surprised that almost everybody gets back to early Islamic history, and then they don't know their history anymore. And I believe what happened is that during the early years of Islam, you can read it in the histories, is there was a huge messing around of where everybody lived. One of the things when conquering powers come in is they move things around. Pol Pot did this over in Asia. He literally picked up villages and split people up and moved people around. He did it to control people because it was easier. Nebuchadnezzar did it. I mean, all these people, they came in and moved people. Islam, I don't know if they purposely did it. They may have in some cases, but a lot of people up and moved. Remember, they had been down in the deserts, or they had been over in southern Jordan. Now it was they up and moved. The Abbas family is a good example. We have their house, we have their history, and Humayma, which is 27 miles south of Petra. They up and move the entire group over to Baghdad. And so they're over there. So that's the Abbasids. Everybody thinks of Abbasids as being from Baghdad and, and then being the caliphs. But if you go back and look at the very roots where they were born, where they came from, it was right beside Petra. So when we hear a name, so somebody says, my family name is Qureshi, he might be Pakistani. So when did that name get over to Pakistan, and when did somebody, maybe he was just a great enthusiast of, or maybe he went to work for somebody whose name was Quraysh and he adopted the Qurayshi name, and then his family kept it going. So when you hear a name, it doesn't necessarily mean that they have a long history all the way back. So there is a problem following tribal names back. However, not everybody moves. So usually when a name starts somewhere, you can trace it back to that area if they haven't all moved or drifted around. So while I was down in southern Jordan. We were doing, writing that first book there and doing a lot of the research. My daughter went to work for a clinic. And so I was one day discussing something with one of the nurses who lived in the clinic, and she said, "Oh, we have all these Qurayshi in our clinic." And my daughter said, "Yeah, we're always registering people from the Quraysh tribe." So I went to look at the book they have in the clinic, where they just listed down the names of the people coming in from the surrounding area, and discovered, wait, there's a whole tribe here of Quraysh people. And so when I began to talk to them, they said, "Oh yeah, we're the original Quraysh tribe." Really? Now that's what they say. I can't prove it. I can't disprove it. But here I am, just a
But
few
neither
miles
can I.
away.
Neither can they, though. That's
I'm
the
40
point.
kilometers away from Petra, and I'm finding over on the eastern side there is the Quraysh tribe that is living there. So again, these names are there. You can, but to try to tie the Quraysh with Mecca and going way back is very, very hard. And we don't have that tribal name appearing in any of the areas around Mecca in rocks or written, you know, and in that way. So there's nothing physical to attach them there as well.
Okay, so
It's one of those 50 things that come up. It's
yeah,
just,
and this is just the thing. The show's coming to an end, but you know, this is the thing that we want everybody to understand, that this idea that Mecca, which as it exists today, is not supported by the sciences, is not supported how we arrive at facts. It's, you know, there's nothing there that indicates that. Everything points north of Mecca, whether that is Petra, whether that's Jerusalem, whether that's the moon. The bottom line is that it's not Mecca. And I think that's the number one thing that, as a polemicist, as somebody who, you know, engages Muslims in these types of discussions all the time, that we need to understand that their whole, I don't say their whole faith system, but the direction of their prayer, nonetheless, their Hajj, one of their 5 pillars, is incorrect. If this information that Dan has provided is true. Dan, I wanted to ask you before we go, is there a way that people can support you and the work that you do besides just buying your books?
if you're talking about money on the YouTube channel, you can give money through Patreon, and that comes straight to us, and that all goes straight into the producing of this. None of us take a salary from this. If you wonder where the money goes to, it goes to buying different time that we have. This week I spent $150 on the report of Khadija's house in Saudi Arabia. I got a hold of it, so a video will be coming out sometime in a month so when I go through the whole archaeological report and look at what they found and what has been properly dated or not dated down there. So I mean, I tried to take that and use the money to get the references so that other people can have access to that and understand what's going on.
All right. Well, we appreciate that. So if there's going to be thousands of people that watch this video. So if you want to support Dan, go to Patreon, look up Dan Gibson. Make sure, I don't know how many Dan Gibsons there are on Patreon.
Or go to nabatea.net, or actually, no, go to the YouTube website. Look up Dan Gibson Petra
Okay.
Mecca on YouTube, and then you can there's a little Patreon button on the corner there.
Okay. Dan, I can't tell you what a blessing.
And subscribe to this one, subscribe to that one. That's very helpful.
Okay. All right. Well, I can't tell you how much of a blessing this has been to me as a host of the show, but everybody else that participates on this show. And I want to give a shout out to Peter Moran, thanking him for reaching out to you and getting you here with us today. It's just been a lot of fun. How much fun can you have on a Sunday afternoon besides sitting in your chair and taking a nap and watching the Bears lose? Who knows? Okay, everybody, I'm going to end the program. Let me go ahead and stop recording here.
Okay, thank you for having me.
Yeah.